Lucas has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Pharmaceutical Chemistry from the University of Toronto. He's a member of a number of professional associations and past presidents of the Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. He was also on the Ethics Committee and a former Gradwell laureate. He's also a past president of the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, the International Association of Forensic Sciences, and a member of 5 editorial boards. He's also a published author and has 29 publications, and probably counting. Mr. Lucas is here today with his wife Marie, and his topic this morning is North of 49, Development of Forensic Sciences in Canada. Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Douglas Lucas.
Talk to you this morning. It was kind of interesting. I looked at your list, the list of the founders, and I was so pleased to see that I knew at least half of them, and was good friends with them. It probably tells you more about my age than about their good taste. But it's a real pleasure to be here. It's over 30 years since I last attended one of your seminars. It was long enough ago that I can tell you that I gave a paper at that one. And for someone who's been around as long as I have, you'll know that it's a pretty rare event at our age to be giving papers. And so today I'm just going to tell stories. I'm not going to give a paper at all. I was kind of interested in reading. I read all of the previous founders' lectures and found that that's the pattern that most of them took also. They told stories. The exception probably was Walter McCrone, who told stories but also gave you things that you could leave that you could use in your laboratory. That probably is no surprise to anybody, since my experience with Walter McCrone is that 10 minutes spent with him is the equal of a week in a library anywhere. So this is about story. When I was first invited to make this presentation, I proposed a couple of topics to your program chairs, and this is the one that they selected, something about Canada and the development of forensic sciences there. And I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about this subject, because we are your largest neighbor. We are your biggest trading partner. Something of the order of $1 billion a day in trade crosses the border. And yet we are, in my experience, so little known in this country. And so I'm always pleased to have the opportunity to tell anybody, anywhere, a little bit more about Canada. I don't think either John or Ray or I knew that this week we would be upstaged by Joan London and Charles Gibson on Good Morning America, who have been spending the whole week in Canada and telling you all of the cliches about Canada. I think my challenge is to perhaps correct some of those myths and tell you something about the real world in Canada. But in order to tell you something about the development of forensic science in Canada, I need to tell you a little bit about our geography, because that affects how forensic science is delivered. A little bit about our history that will explain how we are and why we are the way we are. A little bit about our court system and our policing system, because obviously those impact on the delivery of forensic science. And then I'll tell you some more about forensic science as it has been and is now practiced in the country to your north. A little bit about the geography to begin with. As those of you who have watched Good Morning America this week know, or perhaps already know, there are many images that people have about Canada. To some, the image is that of a very large, cosmopolitan, clean, relatively crime-free urban location. Some of the cities with old world charm, and in some of which they speak a foreign language. Others may have a picture of beautifully forested, lake-filled wildernesses populated by Indian guides, lumberjacks, 5-pound trout, and 10-pound blackflies. If we had more time, I'd tell you a longer story about this particular gentleman, who was Canada's most famous artist, still is, and there still is a considerable mystery 80 years after his death about how he died, and more significantly, where he's buried, and forensic science has played a significant role in that. But for those of you who are interested and have the price of a beer, I'll tell you that story later. Still others probably have some vague idea of a huge expanse of snow-covered moose pasture somewhere north of Buffalo. And that's true. And if we had more time, I'd tell you a little bit more about this story in which forensic science helped to solve a 100-year-old murder in the deep Arctic. But whatever the image is that you may have or others have, it's probably valid, because Canada is all of those things and more. It's the second largest country in the world. From and somewhere up here, did somebody steal the laser? At the top left.
Nope.
Is there a forensic scientist in the house? We have a theft. Well, Canada is that part north of the part that you recognize, and from St. John's, Newfoundland, which is so far east it's off the map here, to Victoria. Button right there. Thank you. To Victoria over here, which is to the far west, is about 4,800 miles. In fact, when you're at St. John's here, you're much closer to England than you are to parts of central Canada. From Pelee Island, right down here, to Alert, which is up here, is about 2,900 miles. In fact, when you are at Alert and you have a magnetic compass in your hand, it points south, because the magnetic North Pole is actually within Canada. We allow other people to use it. The magnetic North Pole is just about up in here in the Queen Elizabeth Islands. That seems like a lot, but let me just put that in perspective. Pelee Island here is on about the same level as Redding, California. Edmonton, up in here, which many people consider to be a northern city, is on the same level as Dublin, Ireland. Edmonton, by the way, is where we keep the highly secret factory that produces the cold winds that your weathermen always tell you are coming down from Canada. When I was director of the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto here, I was closer to Florida than I was to Ontario. In fact, Ontario may be one of the jurisdictions anywhere that has polar bears and grapevines within a single jurisdiction. The population of Canada is about 29 million people. That's roughly the tenth of your population. They live in 10 provinces and 2 territories up here. There's so few people up here they can't qualify for provincial status, although this is changing to some extent there. Despite that enormous area, this population, 90% of the population live within 200 borders. Mention perhaps also, we talk about this border, we tend to forget there is this border up here that's almost 1,000 miles long. And in fact, about half the population of Canada here, south of 49th parallel that is established at the border. That's why I used it in the topic. So this distribution of population has a significant impact on the way that forensic science is delivered in Canada. Canada is officially bilingual, 2 languages. In fact, in the province of Quebec, about 8% of the people speak French only. That has an impact on the way forensic science is delivered. A little bit about our history. The first settlers came from France, and they came, this is a remarkable waterway that allows you to come from Europe and come halfway across a continent by water. And so they settled along this area here along the St. Lawrence and in Quebec. As European settlers, they were subject to the conflicts that occurred back in Europe, and there were constant conflicts between England and France, and those spilled over into North America. And in 1759, there was a decisive battle fought in Quebec in which about 9,000 people took part, and both generals for both sides were killed. And you'll note the red coats that have some significance. And as a result of that battle, the battles between who owned Canada were settled, and in 1763, Canada officially became part of Great Britain. During the American Revolution, or as we call it, that damn rebellion, a lot of people remained loyal to the Crown and fled to Canada, and most of the first English-speaking settlers, many of them at least, were loyalists who came from the New England colonies. In 1812, that was not the only conflict between your country and ours. In 1812, President Madison declared war on Britain because of the embargo on British shipping as a result of still continuing conflicts in Europe that had nothing to do with North America. And so the War of 1812 was fought largely back and forth across here. There was all this rest of it, but most of the battles occurred here, a few up in here, and then they did extend down. And eventually the Battle of New Orleans, which was one of the few that you guys won, actually occurred after the war was over, except nobody knew the war had been settled in Europe and the news hadn't got back to North America yet. You have a couple of legacies from that war, by the way. There was a raid on Baltimore. You people hated York, which is now Toronto, and you set fire to it and burned it down. And so in retaliation, we came down and raided Baltimore and Washington, and at Fort McHenry, a fellow named Key wrote a poem about rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air, and that has still some significance here, I understand. During that same skirmish, in retaliation for burning York, we went over and set fire to a lot of buildings in Washington, D.C., one of which happened to be the house the president lives in, and as a result of that fire, they had to cover up the damage, so they whitewashed it, and ever since it's been known as the White House. So that's a couple of legacies you owe to Canadians. One of the differences between our two countries is that Canada was not born in revolution. In typically Canadian fashion, it was born after an endless series of boring political discussions. Finally, in 1867, the British Parliament proclaimed the British North America Act, which is our Constitution. And that combined 4 of the provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, into the newly independent country of Canada, which had its capital at Ottawa. Ottawa was chosen as the capital because it has such a rotten climate, nobody in their right mind would ever try and capture it. And so it has remained our capital ever since. And over the next 30 or 40 years, the other provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia joined. And finally, in 1949, Newfoundland, that island away out in the east there, came in as part of the Confederation. Under the BNA Act, which is our Constitution, as I say, the only authority that remained in England was the Parliament, although many people think we still are somehow connected with England. We are not. But there was an authority left in England, and that is the power to amend the Constitution. And the only reason that was left in England was because we couldn't agree on how to do it. And so it was left there until 1982, when out of a sense of frustration, all of Canada, with the exception of one province, said, hey, this is crazy, we're going to have this way of doing it. The one province that disagreed was the province of Quebec, and that continues to be a source of conflict in Quebec, the disagreement over its sovereignty. From our point of view, the thing of significance about our Constitution is that it gives to the federal government the power to enact the criminal law. And we've had a criminal code in Canada since 1892, which is uniform across the entire country. At the same time, the BNA Act gives to the provinces the responsibility for the administration of justice. So we have a uniform federal criminal code, but each province has its system of justice, its administration of courts, policing, and, of course, forensic science. A little bit about our government. The federal and provincial governments are parliamentary in nature. Our federal parliament consists of an elected House of Commons, which is the effective body that passes legislation, including the criminal code and amendments to it, and an appointed Senate, which is considered to be a chamber of sober second thought, is the way it's described. And in fact, it does serve a purpose, because it allows some continuity, particularly with a group who are not driven by, can we get elected sometime in the next 4 years, or re-elected. The executive authority, unlike yours, is part of Parliament. The legislative and the executive groups are very much combined, and the executive, the Prime Minister, is in fact a member of Parliament. He's the leader of the party that has the greatest number of seats, and so he must sit in the House of Commons. We have another group. The leader of the party with the second largest number of seats is officially known as the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And there's considerable irony right now that this person happens to be the leader of the party that has as its main goal the separation of Quebec from the rest of Canada. His loyalty to Her Majesty is sometimes in question. In the provinces, the organization of the legislative branches is very similar, except they don't have any equivalent of the Senate. Our courts, as I say, are provincial responsibilities. The judges are appointed. They're appointed essentially for life or until they reach the age of 75. The one limitation is they're appointed on condition of good behavior. They can be removed. There are two levels of courts: provincial courts, which try what we call summary conviction offenses, which you would call misdemeanors, and there are superior courts called different things in different provinces, but they try what we call indictable offenses, which would be the equivalent of felonies. The provincial courts, there are no juries. In the superior courts, there may or not be a jury for a criminal trial, and that is at the election of the accused person. Judges, as I say, are appointed. Charges are preferred in a kind of an interesting way. The crown, which is our symbol, really, the way that yours is the flag and the people. So charges are officially preferred as Her Majesty the Queen versus so-and-so and so-and-so. Usually abbreviated to Regina versus Jones or what have you. Prosecutions are conducted by Crown Attorneys, who are appointed individuals, not elected, in each county and district. One difference being that Crown Attorneys have no investigative authority or responsibility. That remains with the police. It's the job of the Crown Attorney to provide legal advice to the police and to present the case that the police present to them. Disclosure of the Crown's case is mandatory. Death investigation, which has an impact on forensic science, is conducted by coroners or medical examiners, depending on the province. The name is different, but essentially the process is the same. They're medical doctors, most of whom are part-time, paid on a fee-for-service basis. They have the authority to order autopsies, which are done by pathologists, who may or may not be forensic pathologists. And more importantly, they have the authority to order the local police that has jurisdiction in the area to conduct the investigation. So there's no such thing as a coroner or medical examiner investigator. That is done by the police, but under the authority of the coroner, and the coroner has enormous authority if he chooses to exercise it. Occasionally we have public inquests, about 1% of the cases that go to public inquests, and only there are those in which there's some major public safety issue. And the responsibility then is for a jury to hear all of the evidence and then make recommendations that hopefully will prevent that sort of issue arising again. And they have been very, very successful in getting changes in law and changes in regulation. Going on to the police. In the earliest days in Canada, as I guess in this country as well, the duty of keeping the peace was a public responsibility. And in our country, it was borne by, and I quote from the legislation, all free, fit, and proper males between the ages of 15 and 60. So there were a lot of people that could be law enforcement officers. And as the settlers prospered, of course, they decided this was something they didn't want to do, so they hired stand-ins to do it for them. And as a result of that, we had what were called high constables appointed to represent these other people. And that, of course, evolved then into permanent police officers. One of the things that Joan London had wrong this week was talking about the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They are often identified as a national symbol of Canada, and they make a very colorful symbol, there's no question about that. And they're often considered to be our historic police force, and yet municipal and provincial police preceded them by about 50 years. They existed long before the RCMP. There were problems, however, in the sparsely pointed west. I mentioned that most of the population is down here, but there are people out in this area, and there are some policing. And the biggest problem, may be of no surprise to you, came from down here in the form of whiskey traders. And they did create problems with the Indian population in this area. As a matter of fact, Sitting Bull, after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, fled up into Canada here and had to be controlled. And that control was exercised by a group which were formed called the Northwest Mounted Police. Because of this problem, in 1873, the Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, passed an act to establish the Northwest Mounted Police. And they advertised for recruits, and the recruits were required to be, and I quote, able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 40 years who know how to ride a horse. That was the major qualification, and they were successful and recruited them. They paid 75 cents a day. And finally, they recruited all these group, and from Winnipeg, which is, I guess, somewhere in around here, in 1874, this army, really, but police force, set forth with 275 men, 339 horses, 142 oxen, and 189 wagons on a 1,000-mile march to go out to Fort Hoopup, which is out here in Alberta, to control the problems with the Indian population. They established their headquarters eventually in Saskatchewan, or what is now Saskatchewan, in a city which was then called Pile of Bones. You can understand perhaps where that name came from, and you may also understand why, as modern times came, the name was changed, and it's now the city of Regina. They had their headquarters there. They started patrolling all of this area here, mostly by horse and by dog, and eventually got up this far in about 1890. In 1904, their reputation was being so effective was such that King Edward VII gave them the designation Royal, so they became the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. And finally, as their stature across the country expanded, in 1920, they were renamed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so the RCMP actually, as an organization, dates only from about 1920, although their predecessors clearly are older than that.
What may be of interest to you is that as a federal police agency, the RCMP have jurisdiction over a great many federal statutes, but because the enforcement of the law is a provincial responsibility, the RCMP have no responsibility per se with respect to the criminal law. What happened, though, was that as policing became more expensive and provinces, which were relatively unpopulated and with small tax bases, decided policing became very expensive, all of the provinces except 2 hired the RCMP on contract to provide policing, so that the RCMP, in fact, are policing the criminal law in most of Canada, with the exception of Ontario and Quebec, but they do it by virtue of contracts just with the provincial governments, or in some cases with municipalities. They're actually municipal police, but they're that on the basis of contract. Ontario and Quebec are the 2 exceptions to that, which still maintain their own provincial police forces and their municipal police forces. So that has an effect on the way forensic science is developed. Well, the RCMP, as I've just indicated, originated as a quasi-military force, and so many of their traditions come from the military, and the red coat, still their ceremonial dress, obviously derives from their military background. They had horses, they used dog sleds, and as a matter of fact, the last dogs were retired only in 1969. They still use dogs as a major form of transportation up to there. The horses are pretty well all gone. They still keep a small troop in Ottawa, which travels all over the world in connection with something that's known as the RCMP Musical Ride, which is a very effective public relations group. I haven't mentioned sheriffs, as you'll notice, and the reason for that is that although we do have sheriffs in each of the counties or districts, they have no responsibility whatsoever in the investigation of the criminal law. They're responsible only for helping with the administration of the courts. Well, let me go on now to forensic science. I think when people think of Canada, including Canadians, the word first is not something that leaps immediately to mind. If I were to ask you about any Canadian inventions or discoveries, some of you might remember insulin was discovered by Canadians, and you might sort of intuitively think that the snowmobile was invented by Canadians, and you'd be correct. But there are some others that you might want to remember the next time that you play Trivial Pursuit, which is in fact a Canadian invention. The gas mask was a Canadian invention. The electric organ, the paint roller, the pocket pack of Kleenex, and the pop-up handle 12-pack of beer were all Canadian inventions. Of more significance, perhaps Standard Time was a Canadian invention. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell made the first long-distance telephone call from his father's home in Brantford, Ontario, to Paris. Perhaps not the Paris you think of in France, but Paris, Ontario, which is 5 miles away from Brantford. The first commercial jet passenger plane was designed, built, and flown in Canada in 1949. But then, in typical Canadian fashion, we decided we couldn't afford to build it, and nobody would want to buy it anyway. And so we built jet fighters instead. The first commercial oil well in North America was discovered in Ontario in 1857. That was 2 years before the first one was discovered in Pennsylvania. But again, in typical Canadian fashion, we decided there really isn't a need for 2 such wells in North America, so we closed ours down. In fairness, I have to say, though, that our oil did have a very high sulfur content, which made it unpleasant to use in lamps, which was the main use for it in those days. It was interesting, however, to find an advertisement in the London, Ontario, I should hasten to add, Free Press, in 1859 that said, Professor Croft of Toronto, after much labor, has succeeded in deodorizing the oil and rendering it useful as an article of commerce. And that was of interest to us because Professor Croft was also the first forensic scientist in Canada. But for forensic scientists, I suppose the most significant Canadian first was the founding of the first government-funded forensic science laboratory in North America, and one of the very first anywhere in the world, and that was in Montreal in July of 1914. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The first use of science by the police and the courts that I've been able to find in Canada was, as you might expect, the evidence of medical practitioners who were able to do their thing with respect to cause of death. The first Canadian that I found that was doing this was a man by the name of Dr. William Dunlop. He was a graduate of the University of Edinburgh and, in fact, taught medical jurisprudence at that university in the 1820s. He emigrated to Canada. He did practice forensic medicine, but he was well known for a number of other things, and he established such a formidable reputation that everybody knew him by the name Tiger Dunlop. There aren't many Tiger forensic scientists. I've never heard John DeHaan referred to as Tiger DeHaan, although he might well qualify for that. But we remember Tiger Dunlop not so much for his activities as a forensic scientist as for the unusual wording of his last will and testament, part of which said, "I leave Parson Chavas a small token of my gratitude for the service he has done my family in taking a sister no man of taste would have taken." In 1859, this gentleman, Professor Henry Holmes Croft, who I mentioned earlier with respect to the oil, testified at the trial of Dr. William Henry King in Cobourg, Ontario, just down in here, that he had found 11 grains of arsenic in the stomach of Mrs. Sarah King. Dr. King was charged with the murder and was subsequently convicted and executed. And this is the first record that I've been able to find of the use of science other than medical science in Canada. Croft was born in England in 1820, received his education in the University of Berlin, and in 1843, at the age of only 23, he was recommended by no less an authority than Michael Faraday to become the first professor of experimental philosophy and chemistry. A marvelous title. I'm not sure that it's not an oxymoron, experimental philosophy, but in King's College, which is now the University of Toronto. His laboratory still exists. This, by the way, I'm not sure when this picture was taken, but for those of you who've done any toxicology or used to do toxicology years ago, that's remarkably like a Gutzeit apparatus, which was not developed until 1879. He retired in 1879, so it may be that... This is Croft's laboratory, still exists here. This is University College of the University of Toronto. It's a round building, you'll notice, and it's kind of off and kept from the rest of the building. And there was good reason for this, because Croft had a penchant for working with what we would now call well-seasoned evidence. And in the absence of refrigeration and the long distances samples had to travel, that well-seasoned evidence probably would have had some impact on the rest of the university, so they separated them like that. And it still exists and is named after Professor Croft. Well, back to the trial of Dr. King. There was a book written about it, and the title of it I have to read. It's called, this is just the title, not the preface, Dr. King's Life, Trial, Confession, and Execution, together with the journal Prison Scenes in Berkeley, also the causes which led him to commit the awful crime. They just don't make titles like that anymore. Professor Croft testified that after finding the arsenic in Mrs. King's stomach, he wrote to the coroner and asked him to send Sarah's liver and kidneys, since the arsenic might have been added to the stomach after death when it was displayed to the coroner's jury, which was the practice in those days. I think Professor Croft may have had a premonition of what we now call the Furman factor. Croft then testified that he really didn't find very much arsenic in the liver and the kidneys, certainly not sufficient to cause death. testified to this to the jury. The jury apparently didn't agree with him, and they convicted Dr. King anyway. The book doesn't really tell us anything about whether Professor Croft learned anything from this and learned anything about fallibility, because as Dr. King was mounting the gallows steps, he confessed that he had indeed murdered his wife, but with morphine, not arsenic. Croft also testified about other things. In 1876, in a case of a husband who was charged with stabbing his wife, that not only were some stains on the knife blood, he used Van Dien's Wacom test, but they were, and I quote, blood from one who could nurse young, end quote. Presumably he meant a female. For reasons upon which we can only speculate, he didn't testify about that any further in his career that we could find. Croft was succeeded by one of his students, this gentleman, Dr. William Hodgson Ellis, who had degrees in both chemistry and medicine. And in fact, we have a record of his laboratory forensic science life. His case book from 1896 to 1912 still exists in the library at the Center of Forensic Sciences, and it's a remarkable document because there's so many things that all of us would recognize as being the way we do things still. Some differences. In a rape murder case in 1878, it's all handwritten, but this is just a close-up. He refers to the items that he examined, and in fact, in the book, there's a photograph of the weapon in this case. In the case in 1878, he testified not only about identifying blood, but he also testified to the significance of the number, size, and position of bloodstains on the trousers of the accused man. He was doing bloodstain interpretation in 1878. He also introduced serological tests in 1904, only 3 years after Willowtooth had discovered them. And can you imagine what Barry Scheck would have done with that rush into court with a unproven science had he been around in those days? He made microscopic examinations of hair in 1897, and this is where his laboratory was. That building still exists in the University of Toronto. It's interesting, though, although he obviously was a fairly competent microscopist, there's no record anywhere in his notes of any examinations for spermatozoa, nor is there any record of any examinations for alcohol, even though the Necluse method for doing alcohol analysis had been published in 1896. One thing in the notebook that was kind of interesting was there was a newspaper clipping about one of his cases in there. It was from the Rat Portage News. Rat Portage is what we now call Kenora. Again, you can perhaps understand why they changed the name. It's dated May 19th, 1900. It describes a coroner's inquest into the death by morphine overdose of one Oliver Doyle. Mr. Doyle is described as a heavy drinker who lived with a lady friend who was the proprietress of a brothel. So the story involved booze, sex, and drugs. It could just as well have been written yesterday as in 1900. Things really don't change that much. Ellis retired in 1919, but not before he made what proved to be his most significant contribution to forensic science. And that was in persuading one of his students, Jocelyn Rogers, to take up the work in 1911. And it's interesting, his name is Linnaeus Jocelyn Rogers. When he was born on a small Ontario farm in 1880, his farm parents could not possibly have predicted what his career was going to be, and yet they named him Linnaeus Jocelyn. Linnaeus, of course, after the great Swedish botanist. Jocelyn was a family name which came from a Quaker-like sect that believed, didn't have preachers, they believed in giving witness. And so Linnaeus Jocelyn was the scientist who gives witness. Can you think of a better name for a forensic scientist than that? And yet that was given to him at birth. He did his master's thesis in 1910 on a method for the analysis of chlorohydrated tissue and became professor of analytical chemistry in the University of Toronto. In 1914, he stayed there until 1954. He then continued active in the field with the Center of Forensic Sciences until 1967. So he had over half a century of experience actively in forensic science during a period of some of the most significant developments that that have ever occurred. He not only expanded, took what had been done with his predecessors, but expanded the areas. He started doing blood alcohols. 1932, he testified in the case of finding alcohol in a gentleman who died after consuming moonshine. And the interesting thing was that the moonshiners, the bootleggers, weren't charged with anything other than having liquor in their possession not purchased from a government vendor. That was a major crime in those days, I guess. And Rogers also developed a lot of the criminalistics techniques, in Canada at least, that we know today with respect to the investigation of fires, explosions, burglaries, hit-and-run crashes, and firearms identification. I noticed in reading Stuart Kine's founder's lecture, which was entitled, "What Makes a Good Forensic Scientist?" he advised that one of the things is choose your parents wisely. And that certainly is good advice, and to that I would add, choose your mentor wisely. I was extremely fortunate in that this gentleman was my mentor, and I learned so much from him, including his philosophy, which essentially was, don't theorize, experiment. Going back to Quebec, in the early 1900s, this is where Rogers' laboratory was in the university. In the early 1900s, this gentleman, Dr. Wilfred Derome, was the director of laboratories at the Notre Dame Hospital in Montreal. And just across the street was the courthouse. And so, not surprisingly, he was often called upon to come across to give some evidence in some issue that he could help with. And to his credit, he realized that he needed to learn more about this business. And so he went to France in 1909 to obtain a diploma in legal medicine in the University of Paris under Professor Balthazard. Balthazard also had an interest in firearms, as some of you may know, and so Derome also became competent in that field, and in fact, in 1929, produced what may be the first book on the subject, entitled Expertise on Armes à Feu. When he returned from Paris, he successfully lobbied the Attorney General of Quebec on the importance of this new specialty, and in July of 1914, the Premier of Quebec announced the establishment of the Laboratoire de Recherche Médico-Légales. I'm not one of those bilingual people, as you can tell. It was established in a room they rented for $75 a month, and he was provided with $2,500 to equip this in 1914. In 1924, it moved to somewhat larger, but no more modern premises at Rue Saint-Vincent, where it stayed there until 1968. That really looks like what a morgue should look like, I think. They stayed there until, as I say, 1968, when they moved to the Sûreté du Québec headquarters building on Rue Parthenay, where they exist today. Interestingly enough, although this was a first and preceded by a long ways most other laboratories, again, there was very little interest in Canada in this, but there was some down here. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover visited this laboratory twice before he set up the FBI laboratory in the 1930s. This institute developed along European lines with the pathologists testifying to the results produced by their staff. Like Herr Professor can do no wrong, and Dr. Derome could do no wrong. And so Derome reported not only on autopsies, but also on fingerprint examinations, biological tests, and firearms examinations. In 1920, they added chemistry and toxicology, and in 1924, he hired an assistant, Dr. Rosario Fontaine, who also had studied in France and had also studied document examination under Edmond Locard in Lyon. And so document examination was added to their menu. And it wasn't until the 1950s that they started to change from Herr Professor or Le Professeur testifying about everything to the more conventional technique of people doing the work, testifying to it, and to the sectional sort of organization which by then existed in other Canadian labs. Derome published the first Canadian treatise on forensic medicine, Précis de médecine légale, in 1920, but an interesting publication he made, which is interesting perhaps to this group, in 1930 he described the effects of alcohol on people in a publication. And I'm going to read a little bit of that to you, and based on his description, you have to believe that tolerance to alcohol was much greater in those days than it is today. Although his results are published or reported in by volume rather than by weight as we do, even when you make the conversion, you get some rather remarkable figures. What he said was, 1, to the figures 1, 2, and 3 cc's of absolute alcohol per liter corresponds a rather late intoxication. Some excitement and volubility may generally be observed. A flood of ideas assails the individual, particularly those of haughtiness and immodesty, which is sufficient evidence that the judgment is already perverted. 2, the figures 4, 5, and 6 cc's per liter represent the real phases of drunkenness, which are productive of all sorts of crimes, obscene talk, abusive language, quarrels, wounding, rape, murder, etc. I'm not sure what etc. is left after that. In that stage, the criminal act needs no explanation. It is rather expected. 3, the figures 7, 8, and 9, 9, and 10 show our individual in the paralytic and comatose stages of alcoholic intoxication. He may be seen sleeping himself sober in a rear corner of a ditch. Such pathological condition, however, is not without interest to the alienist on whom is incumbent the task of explaining the apparently beneficent loss of memory invocated by the drunkard concerning the motive of his criminal act. Don't you wish you'd written that? I think anyone who can write like that clearly is deserving of enormous respect, and this was recognized by the Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences when it established its highest award of merit, which is known as the Derome Medal. Derome died in 1932, was succeeded by Dr. Fontaine, and then in 1964 by Dr. Jean-Marie Roussel. Today, this laboratory is known as Direction des Expertises Judiciaires and is headed by Yves Saint-Marie. It's part of the Ministry of Safety and Security and has 6 sections: toxicology and alcohol, chemistry and physics, biology, documents, and casino. Now, you may wonder what that's doing in there, but in fact, with legalized government gambling, they have now turned to forensic laboratories in both Quebec and Ontario to be quality control for some of the video machines that are used in casinos. They also have pathology. It's the only Canadian laboratory that still has forensic pathology as part of its service. Forensic accounting is part of this organization, and the staff of about 105 are all civilian. There was another Canadian first, that one of which we're not so proud, and that is the first bombing of a commercial passenger airline in flight, which occurred in Quebec in 1949. And 2 of the chemists from this laboratory really started what now is conventional work in bombing cases. They did an enormous amount of experimentation and eventually were able to conclude with some residues they found that there had been a dynamite bomb exploded in the baggage compartment of this plane, and they also found remains of an ever-ready battery, which was significant, and 2 people eventually were charged, convicted, and executed for that crime. Going to Ontario, then after Croft and Ellis and Rogers, the second forensic science laboratory as such was established by the Attorney General of Ontario in 1952. Dr. Frankish was a pathologist who had studied with Derome. Derome's influence is significant right across the country. And he had already established a private laboratory when he was asked to become director in 1932. Most of his work was traveling back and forth across the province doing autopsies, but he had a technician who remained in the laboratory in, this is another classic location for a forensic laboratory, Park Crescent, which is where the first Attorney General's lab in Toronto was established. So he had a technician who stayed there doing the actual laboratory work. This situation continued with a series of medical directors who really weren't very active, and one technician who's in this terrible old place doing the work until 1951. In that year, the Attorney General decided it was time to revitalize this laboratory. He invited another pathologist, Dr. Noble Sharp, to to become director, but to his credit, Dr. Sharp recognized, but by this time, forensic science was not limited to medicine and to medical science, and he recommended that it be a real scientist who be the director, and he would do pathology. And so the Attorney General went to the university and recruited Dr. H. Ward Smith, who was a professor of pharmacology, and he started and really began what is now modern forensic science in the province of Ontario. Later that year, they moved from that other building to this one, which still exists, which was at one time the Hospital for Sick Children. That's where I started, in this building. We had 3,000 square feet of space, which we thought was more than ample at the time, and Dr. Smith began to assemble a group of scientists around him. From the very beginning, this laboratory operated on a specialist basis. In 1957, they'd outgrown this space, moved to about 11,000 square feet in this building, which was at one time a liquor warehouse. This building was shared with the Ontario Provincial Police headquarters, and Dr. Smith made, I think, a very significant move with respect to forensic science in Canada, and although we shared the building, he insisted that we had a separate entrance, a separate address, a separate identity entirely from the provincial police. And he also insisted that reports go to the Crown Attorney, that they go not just to the investigating officer, but they go to the person who is going to prosecute it in order to retain this idea of independence. The name was changed in 1966 to the Center of Forensic Sciences, where it is today. It's part of the Ministry of the Solicitor General, and in 1975 moved into this building in downtown Toronto, where it occupies about 70,000 square feet of space. It also is sectionalized, having biology, which includes serology, hairs, fibers, DNA since 1990, chemistry, which includes a whole range of trace evidence, and also includes the casino operation that I mentioned, documents, photography, firearms, tool marks, and toxicology. And the toxicology includes quality control of police breath testing across the province. One laboratory in Toronto is difficult to serve that big area, and so in 1992 we established a northern laboratory in this building, and it's located there right on the St. Mary's River. It's a gorgeous location. Can never get anybody to leave there. That serves Northern Ontario with a staff of 13. The total staff now is about 140, and they provide services to all law enforcement officers, coroners, and other investigators in the province. And as in the other Canadian labs, at the present time at least, there is no direct fee for any of this service, although, as I'm sure you would guess, there is pressure in that direction. Going to the RCMP laboratories now. In 1931, the commissioner of the RCMP decided it was time to get into this forensic science business, or crime lab business, whatever, and so he wrote to a lot of the major police forces in the U.S. to ask for advice on how to do this. Not surprisingly, he didn't get a lot of replies because there weren't a lot that knew much more about it here. He did get one, however, which is kind of interesting, from the president of the Northwest Association of Sheriffs of Police. And this person recommended to the commissioner that, beyond anything else, the police background of personnel running the establishment could not be overly emphasized. Doctors and chemists, ordinarily without a criminal investigation background, are unsuited to this class of work. So many things will occur to the experienced investigator which would not occur to the doctor or chemist who have not been trained along investigative lines, that any comparisons between the two types are odious. I suppose there may be some here who would take exception to that, but it was the conventional wisdom then, and still is in some departments, and it certainly was for a long time in the RCMP. In 1936, Dr. Maurice Powers, a graduate in medicine from McGill, heard about the commissioner's interest in establishing a medical legal department. So he wrote the commissioner applying for the position. Powers had indeed attended lectures at McGill given by Jerome and by Fontaine. So again, Jerome's influence is noted. Dr. Powers was inducted into the RCMP as force surgeon. That was his title. There wasn't anything else appropriate to call him. and he had a starting salary of $150 a month. As soon as he started, he was sent to New York to study for 6 months in the medical examiner's office there and at the NYPD. He studied serology, microscopy, toxicology, photography, and ballistics, as well as pathology. That amount of training in so many subjects might seem ludicrous to us today, but it was pretty much the norm for that time. When he returned to Regina, it had changed its name from Pile of Bones, where the RCMP training depot is located, he was anxious to start applying his expertise, but the commissioner wrote to the commanding officer of training depot. He had some concern about this civilian doctor not really fitting in very well with this military operation. And at a training academy, you can imagine, he wrote to the commander of the training division, "As Surgeon Powers has had no training, we Marines have an officer who personal instruction, particularly in saluting, as is necessary for children in the force." So the commissioner had his priorities. We know where they were. In September of 1937, the commissioner formally announced that the scientific laboratory had been established in Regina to assist all of the divisions, one laboratory to serve the entire country. Again, this geography has an impact on us. The facility was quite modest. It was a bedroom in the officer's mess. And it eventually moved into a proper facility in 1953, and it occupied this until it moved into a new laboratory building just last year. Powers began to assemble police officers as his staff, given this advice from the president of Northwest Sheriff's Association. And some of these were then sent for training in question document examination, in fingerprint and photography. A gentleman by the name of James Churchman was a sergeant at the time who was in charge of the Montreal Drug Squad, had some background in firearms because he'd been in the British Army in World War I. And by coincidence, he had just published an article entitled "Power and Ball" in the RCMP Quarterly, so he was an automatic candidate to be their firearms examiner. He went to New York for study. And Lance Corporal James Robinson came from the Northwest Territory Patrol, this dog sled patrol we've been talking about. If you can imagine better qualification for a hairs and fibers person than that, I don't know what. He certainly knew about dog hairs anyway. But he was truly a remarkable person and is still fondly remembered by all members who ever dealt with him in the RCMP. So much to the point that the laboratories of the RCMP have an annual curling bonspiel, which will mean nothing to you in California, but is a big thing in Canada, and they call it the Robbie after him. One of the things that he recalled was his attempt to build a collection of hair standards. And so he wrote to a constable in the Northern Patrol that he just left to obtain samples from the Eskimo. And so he sent this constable 4 envelopes which were pre-labeled: scalp, male; scalp, female; pubic, female. And in due course, the first 3 envelopes arrived, but the 4th one didn't. There was a rather apologetic handwritten note from the constable that said, "I am not able to fill the 4th request as the women I know well enough are not in the settlement at the present time." There are problems. Once the pattern of specialized examiners had been established in Regina, this is Powers here, Church once that had been established, Powers recognized that it was really impractical to try and serve the entire country from one location. And so he lobbied and was successful in getting the commissioner to open a second laboratory in Ottawa in 1942. In 1943, unfortunately, Powers was not able to really exploit his new title of Director of Laboratories for the RCMP because he was killed in an aircraft accident while flying from North Battleford to Saskatoon in an RCMP plane. And this was a great loss to the RCMP and to forensic science in Canada. Eventually, Churchman, that firearms person I mentioned, became an inspector and director of laboratories, and he began the process of further regionalization with the establishment of another laboratory in the Maritime Provinces in Sackville, New Brunswick in 1957. This laboratory has a kind of an interesting history. They kept moving from one place to another. Nobody was prepared to spend enough money to give them a proper laboratory. And in one of the locations, it was so bad that the director of the laboratory wrote to the commissioner and complaining, and one of the things he said was, the bullet recovery apparatus is housed separately in a chicken shed a quarter of a mile away. I suspect that may not be so atypical. Some of you may have worked in something akin to a chicken shed at some point in your early life. One of the features of the parliamentary form of government that I mentioned earlier is that members of the cabinet, because they're also members of the House of Commons, they must attend in the House of Commons each sitting day during what is called question period, when they can be asked any question about their portfolio by any member of the opposition. And you will immediately recognize, those of you who are directors of laboratories, that the astute got so much hardware here. Am I still plugged in? Am I still not in? There's some help wires here. I'm going to hang myself. There's got to be a... Yeah, okay. No, still not working. I think there's a... battery fell out. Which one? There's a battery. Do you have one in your pocket? No.
Is there an electrician in the house?
Oh, here we go. Wait a second. All right, I think you're back on. Go ahead.
Are we on now?
You're on.
Don't move.
Here, I'll put it right here.
Now that I have your attention again, we're talking about question period, and you'll recognize that astute managers in the public service have been known to take advantage of this by quietly slipping some information to members of the opposition who can then ask a question during question period. Now, I can't confirm that the RCMP was in fact the source of this particular thing, but they'd been trying to open a laboratory in Vancouver for several years and unsuccessfully. And in July of 1960, a question was asked of the minister responsible for the RCMP, who also happened to be represent a British Columbia constituency. Question was asked, I am told that one or two RCMP members spend more time traveling by plane to court in British Columbia than they spent in the laboratory at Regina. Would the minister tell us what study has been made of the situation and whether any thought has been given to the establishment of a laboratory in British Columbia? A couple of years later, a laboratory opened in Vancouver. In fact, one member of the serology section in Regina had traveled 89,000 miles in 1 year testifying in British Columbia. The building they first were established in, hadn't been built as a forensic laboratory, and again, the director kept complaining, and in one of the complaints he sent to Ottawa, he said that the concrete blocks used to bulletproof the firing room are not sufficient to prevent a bullet from escaping the building. This would lead to adverse publicity, to say the least. In fact, the bullet did escape once, but did only damage to the marble in the lobby. And so this sort of thing kept on. In Alberta, they decided they needed a laboratory. The Attorney General of Alberta threatened to open 2 of his own, one in Calgary, one in Edmonton. 2 major cities in Calgary who can't put down anything, so if you put one there, you have to put another one there. And the RCMP said, we don't want that, we'll give you a laboratory, and they opened one in Edmonton in 1968. In Winnipeg, they opened one in 1970. It's very hard for a politician to resist the very compelling argument, well, if they have one, I should have one too, which is what the Bill the Sackville Laboratory that was built in the Maritimes the facility never did improve, and so they opened the laboratory in Halifax. They were going to close the one in Sackville. When they closed the one in Halifax, again, anyone who's ever tried to close a laboratory in a community will appreciate that it can't be done. So Halifax opened, Sackville didn't close, and they kept there. It didn't close until there was an austerity program. And so we had this system of laboratories in the RCMP across the country, of laboratories in Vancouver, Edmonton, Regina, Winnipeg, Ottawa, and Halifax. They started with uniform members, all of them. Eventually, they had a very good program of sending people to university, some up to the PhD level while they were members of the force, but eventually they couldn't keep up, and so they decided to civilianize the laboratories. The RCMP has what they call civilian members and regular members. The regular members being those who wear a uniform. And so they civilianized, but as you might expect in an organization with this military background, the status of the civilians, regardless of their academic qualifications, is somewhat lesser. They're allowed to use the sergeant's mess but they just don't have the status to allow them in the officer's mess. But they're now almost entirely civilianized. Only about just under 5% of the 350 members of the RCMP laboratories are still uniformed people, and they're being retired slowly. The current director of laboratories is Dr. Harold Peel. Some of you may know. He's the first civilian to hold that position, which has the equivalent in rank of assistant director. Across the rest of the country, there really wasn't very much else. In British Columbia, there was a laboratory in the mines department that started helping the police in 1890, but really didn't do a lot of service and eventually burned down in 1958, and that ended that. Also in Vancouver, there was a city analyst laboratory, which started doing work in the 1920s. They did some toxicology, a little bit of criminalistics work, but that ended in 1995 when the city closed that lab. The only other laboratory, really, the Vancouver Police Department does have within its establishment both firearms and documents examination, but that's the only laboratory other than the RCMP that is within a police organization other than fingerprints. There are toxicology laboratories, one in Halifax in a hospital and another with the chief medical examiner in Edmonton, or Calgary rather. There are no training programs, university programs in forensic science in Canada. All of the forensic training is done in-house in the laboratories. The Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences, which is similar to your organization, was established in 1953. And the first meeting, there were 21 persons attended and 7 papers. Interestingly enough, the name of the organization that was agreed to originally was the Canadian Forensic Society. And it wasn't until 6 years later they recognized this problem of bilingualism that we have. The original proposal for the name came from Dr. Roussel in Montreal and was in French, and then 6 years later they realized the word science had been left out of the name when they corrected that title. One of the interesting symbols of the society is it has a special gavel that passes from one president to the next, and it's entirely Canadian. It preserves the old medieval tradition of the person in authority having some weapon that has a spike in it. Our gavel has a spike, which is in fact the wedge that holds the head and the handle together, but the spike is made of a mastodon tusk that came from the Yukon River. The society now has a membership of about 600, and in addition to having meetings annually, such as you do, it has a number of committees that have a very important role as officially advisors in science to the Minister of Justice, the federal Minister of Justice, who's responsible for criminal legislation. And so we have an alcohol test committee that advises the minister on the draft legislation, sets standards for equipment, evaluates equipment and procedures, and recommends for approval. We also have DNA and drugs and driving committees that provide similar advisory services to the Attorney General of Canada. Well, forensic science in Canada has a long and eventful history. Canadian forensic scientists, I think with considerable reason, take great pride in our heritage and in the distinguished predecessors that we have. The development continues, and I expect that sometime in the next 75 years or so that you may choose to invite another Canadian to come and talk to you about some of the eccentric characters of the 1990s in forensic science in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And at this time, I would like to call upon the chair of the Founders Committee and a close personal friend of mine, Tiger DeHaan. This is how nicknames started. You got it, buddy.
Thank you for starting this. It's going to be another 20 years before I live this down. This is indeed a pleasure because the very first American Academy meeting that my professor, Joseph Nickel, took me to as an undergraduate, the first person that I think he introduced me to was Bill Lucas. And even in 1969, it was clear that this man from Canada was an important force Canada. And it's a pleasure to be able to welcome Doug and present to him on behalf of the TAC the plaque and an appreciation for today's wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. Doug's going to be with us for the next couple of days. I'm sure the bar will be open at various times. Be able to take him up on his offer. As chair of the Founders Committee, I want to extend my appreciation to Doug for his cooperation in coming, and to ask you to help me out with nominations for the next Founders Lecture, which will be in 18 months. As you can probably tell, I'm running out of friends that I can ask to do this. And so I'll be happy to hear your invitations to maintain the kind of quality of presentation we've been so fortunate with the past 10 years or so. Thank you very much. Raymond?
Thank you, John.